She live-streamed herself burning his belongings in the front yard, his work shirts, his notebooks, his tools, while 22,000 people watched and her family stood on the porch and applauded. What his wife did not know, what none of them knew, not her father with his name on a building, not her mother with her seating charts and her silent cruelties, not her brother who carried the boxes to the fire with his own hands, was that the quiet man they had spent 8 years treating like a charity case was the sole owner of a land trust worth $81 billion. And 3 of the buildings that bore her family's name? They were sitting on his grandmother's land. She burned his grandmother's photograph in that fire. She did it on camera, in front of the whole neighborhood, in front of the whole internet. What happened next didn't just cost her the marriage. It cost her family everything they had spent 2 generations building. Their buildings, their reputation, their home, and the last name they had polished until it shined. So here is the question: when a man has that kind of power and chooses to stay silent for 8 years, what is he waiting for? If this story already has you leaning forward, hit that like button right now and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And drop your city in the comments. Where are you watching from today? Let's see how far this reaches. Now let me take you back to where this all started, to a Tuesday evening in June, in a neighborhood in New Orleans called Gentilly, where a man came home from work to find his wife already live on Facebook and a metal drum burning in his own front yard. He had been out near Chalmette all day, running survey lines in the June heat, with his boots sinking into soft ground, and the sun pressing down on the back of his neck like a flat iron. Marcus Ellison smelled like work when he turned onto his street, sunscreen and soil, and the particular kind of tired that settles into a man's shoulders after 8 hours of precise, patient labor. He was thinking about the leftover red beans he was going to heat up. He was thinking about taking his boots off at the door. He was not thinking about what he was about to drive into. He saw the glow before he saw the crowd. Orange light flickering against the oak trees, casting long shadows across the front lawn he had mowed 4 days ago. He slowed the F-150 without thinking, the way a man slows when something in his body understands what his eyes haven't confirmed yet. Then he saw the metal drum. Then he saw the fire. Then he saw his wife. Priscilla was standing on the front walkway in a white linen dress, her hair done, her phone extended in front of her like a scepter. She was live. The little red circle in the corner of her screen said 22,000 people were watching. She was speaking in the voice she used when she wanted to sound composed and wronged at the same time. That rehearsed, wounded clarity that Marcus had learned to recognize over 8 years of marriage. Her parents were on the porch. Aldous Fontaine stood with his arms crossed and his chin lifted, wearing the expression of a man presiding over a business transaction that was going exactly as planned. Renee stood just behind his shoulder, in a pale yellow blouse, her lips pressed together in a thin, satisfied line. They had driven 40 minutes from the Garden District for this. They had dressed for it. Deshawn was carrying boxes. Priscilla's younger brother hauled Marcus's belongings out of the front door with the casual ease of a man who had been waiting for permission to do this for years. Work shirts, folded and stacked. Survey notebooks, rubber-banded together. The leather case for his transit level. A pair of worn, steel-toed boots. Each item landed in or beside the metal drum with the indifference of someone emptying a storage unit, not a marriage. Marcus parked 2 houses down. He did not get out right away. He sat with the engine running and watched through the windshield. Priscilla had found her stride now. She was holding up his work badge, the laminated ID from the firm, his photograph on it looking slightly too serious, the way he always looked in photographs, and she was describing it to the camera. She was saying the word surveyor, the way someone says it when they want the word itself to be the insult. She talked about his truck. She talked about his calluses. She talked about how he had nothing to say at her family's dinner parties, how he sat at the table like a man who knew he did not belong there and had simply decided to endure it rather than improve himself. 22,000 people were watching her say these things in front of their home. Marcus got out of the truck. He walked to the edge of the yard and stopped. He did not say anything. Priscilla saw him and did not lower the phone. She raised it slightly, angling the camera so the audience could see him arrive. Dusty boots, stained collar, the whole tableau of everything she was leaving behind. She kept talking. Deshawn dropped a final box near the drum. It split when it landed, and the contents scattered in the grass. More notebooks, a spare compass, and a framed photograph that landed face up, catching the firelight. Ida Mae Ellison looked up at the orange sky from the grass of her grandson's front yard. The photograph was 5 by 7 in a simple wooden frame. Ida Mae, at maybe 60 years old, standing in front of a church Marcus did not recognize, wearing a yellow dress and an expression that had no patience for nonsense. It was the photograph Marcus kept on his nightstand. It had been on his nightstand since the year she died. Deshawn picked it up and dropped it into the drum. The frame caught immediately. What happened next happened fast and quiet. A woman stepped out of the small gathering of neighbors that had formed on the sidewalk. Older, broad-shouldered, moving with the deliberate calm of someone who has decided something. Miss Gloria Washington had lived 4 houses down for 31 years. She had known Ida Mae Ellison from Second Baptist. She had sat beside her at church for 2 decades, eaten her cooking, sung beside her voice. She stepped to the drum and reached in with her bare hand. She pulled the photograph out. The frame was charred at the corners, and the glass was hot. She wiped the soot from the glass with the hem of her shirt, slow and deliberate, the way you handle something sacred. Then she turned and looked at Priscilla with an expression that required no translation. Priscilla kept the phone up. She did not look away from the camera. Renee Fontaine said from the porch that Priscilla had finally done the right thing. Marcus walked to Miss Gloria. She held the photograph out to him with both hands. He took it the same way, both hands like it was being passed across an altar. He looked at it for a moment. He looked at Miss Gloria's face. He did not look at Priscilla, or at his father-in-law, or at the drum still throwing heat and light across the lawn. He walked back to the truck. He placed the photograph on the passenger seat, face up. He drove 2 blocks, pulled to the curb, and turned off the engine. The neighborhood sounds came through the cracked window. Voices, the pop of something in the fire, the low hum of a summer night in Gentilly. Marcus Ellison sat with his hands in his lap and said nothing. Not because he was broken, not because he had no words, but because there was nothing left to say out loud that hadn't already been set in motion a long time ago. To understand that Tuesday night in Gentilly, you have to go back. You have to go back 8 years to a church social at Second Baptist on a Saturday afternoon in October, when the fellowship hall smelled like sweet potato pie, and someone's auntie had the gospel station turned up just loud enough to fill the room without interrupting conversation. That was where Marcus Ellison first saw Priscilla Fontaine, standing near the dessert table in a green dress, laughing at something her friend said. He introduced himself the old-fashioned way, walked over, waited for a pause, said his name and where he was from. She smiled like she hadn't decided yet. By the end of the evening, she had. They were married 11 months later. The Fontaine family's disapproval arrived before the wedding cake was cut. Aldous Fontaine did not make a scene. He was too measured for scenes. He simply asked Marcus at the rehearsal dinner what he did for a living, and when Marcus said land surveyor, Aldous repeated the words slowly, as if he were translating them into a language that didn't have a good equivalent. Then he nodded once and turned to speak to someone else. That was how Aldous communicated everything that mattered, not with words, with the decision to stop using them. Renée Fontaine was more precise. She operated through architecture, the architecture of a room, of a table, of a guest list. At the first Thanksgiving Marcus attended as a member of the family, he found his name card at the far end of a secondary table near the kitchen, beside Priscilla's teenage cousins. The main table, the one with the good china and Aldous at the head, had 11 seats. Marcus was not in any of them. Priscilla saw it and said nothing. She sat at the main table and passed the rolls. That was the beginning. Over the years that followed, Renée perfected the art of erasure without confrontation. In family newsletters she composed and emailed every Christmas, she listed the children and their accomplishments and referred to her daughter as Priscilla Fontaine, not Priscilla Ellison. In conversations at church, at the hair salon, at charity luncheons, Priscilla's husband was always Priscilla's husband, never Marcus, never Mr. Ellison, just a relational category, interchangeable, forgettable, the human equivalent of a +1. Deshawn was less subtle. Priscilla's younger brother had a talent for nicknames that landed just soft enough to be deniable. He called Marcus the groundskeeper at a 4th of July barbecue in the backyard of the Garden District House in front of 11 people because Marcus had arrived carrying a casserole dish and wearing a plain white shirt. Everyone laughed, including Priscilla. She caught herself and stopped, but the laugh had already happened. The next year, Deshawn called him the meter reader at a birthday dinner because Marcus mentioned he had been out doing field assessments all week. Same laugh, same pause from Priscilla, but a shorter pause than the year before. Marcus brought food to every gathering. He fixed the gutter on the Garden District House when he noticed it pulling away from the fascia. He resealed the driveway without being asked. He sat through dinners where the conversation moved around him like water around a stone, never acknowledging him, never including him, finding its own path without his input. He never raised his voice, he never left early. He ate what was served and complimented Renée's cooking with the same quiet sincerity every single time. Once a month, on the third Friday, Marcus drove downtown to a building on Poydras Street in the Central Business District and took the elevator to the 14th floor. He was always there by 10 in the morning and gone by noon. When Priscilla asked, early in the marriage, where he was going, he said it was an errand downtown. She asked once if it was work-related. He said it was more like a check-in. She never asked again. By the third year, she had stopped noticing the third Fridays entirely. There were other things to pay attention to. Her career at the bank was growing, her social calendar was filling, and her family's opinion of her life was a gravitational force she had stopped fighting. The shift in Priscilla happened slowly and then all at once, the way a rope frays, one thread at a time, until the thing that held simply does not hold any more. In the first 2 years of the marriage, she had corrected her mother on the name thing twice at the table. By year 4, she corrected her only in private. By year 6, she did not correct her at all. By year 8, at a family dinner where Deshawn called Marcus the groundskeeper again, in front of new guests, Priscilla refilled her wine glass and looked at the centerpiece and said nothing. That was the moment, not the fire, not the divorce papers, that dinner, that wine glass, that centerpiece. That was when Priscilla Fontaine stopped being a woman who had made a choice and started being a woman who had let her family make it for her. Marcus drove home from that dinner with the radio off. He had a meeting on Poydras Street in 4 days. He thought about what he was going to say when Bertrand Okafor asked him how things were going. He thought he might say they were getting close, what the Fontaines mistook for a man who had been worn down and accepted his place was simply a man who had been measuring all along the exact distance between what they believed and what was true. The offices of Okafor and Whitfield occupied the 14th floor of a building on Poydras Street, where the windows faced east and caught the morning light like a clean sheet of paper. Marcus arrived at 7:45. He was in his work clothes, the same dark pants and collared shirt he wore every day on the job, and he carried Ida May's photograph under his arm, the glass still faintly smudged at one corner where Miss Gloria had wiped the ash away the night before. Bertrand Okafor was already at his desk. He was a tall man in his late 50s, unhurried in every movement, with reading glasses he wore pushed low on his nose when he was working and lifted to the top of his head when he was listening. He had been Marcus's attorney for 11 years. He had known for 11 years exactly what was in the Ida May Ellison family trust. He had been waiting with the particular patience of a man who understood that some things had to ripen at their own pace for a morning exactly like this one. Marcus set the photograph on the desk between them, facing up. Okafor looked at it for a moment. Then he opened the file he had already prepared and laid it flat on the desk, and he began to speak in the measured, organized way he always spoke, not performing the information, simply delivering it, the way a good surveyor delivers measurements. Exactly what was there, nothing added, nothing omitted. He started with Ida May. Between 1959 and 1984, Ida May Ellison had purchased 47 parcels of land. She had done it quietly, parcel by parcel, across Louisiana, Mississippi, and coastal Alabama, during decades when the machinery of this country was designed specifically to prevent a woman who looked like her from owning anything at all. She had paid in full each time, cash transactions properly documented, titles recorded, and held clean. When developers came to her door, they came more than once, with offers that grew more generous each time the land around hers appreciated, she did not sell, she did not negotiate. She told them no with a politeness that left no room for a second visit. She was convinced the land was meant for someone she hadn't met yet. That someone was Marcus. When Ida May died in 2018 at the age of 91, the trust she had established transferred intact to her grandson as sole trustee and sole beneficiary. The 47 parcels, which had appreciated across 6 decades of regional development, infrastructure expansion, and coastal commercial growth, now carried a combined assessed value of $81.7 billion. Marcus already knew this number. But Okafor said it out loud anyway because some numbers need to be spoken in a room to be fully real. $81.7 billion, held in the name of the Ida May Ellison Family Trust. Titles clean, no liens, no encumbrances, no challenges pending. The trust generated $12.3 million annually in ground lease income and development rights fees, passive income that had been accumulating quietly and without fanfare, while Marcus drove his F-150 to survey jobs and ate reheated food in the kitchen of a house where his name was never spoken correctly at the dinner table. Then Okafor turned to the specific page Marcus had been thinking about since the night before. He identified 3 parcels currently under ground lease to Fontaine Property Group. He read the addresses one at a time. The first was a commercial corridor in Metairie. The second was a mixed-use development near the lakefront. The third was 1840 Pointe Claire Boulevard, the address of the Fontaine Centre, Aldous Fontaine's flagship building, the crown jewel of the portfolio he had spent 20 years polishing into a monument to the Fontaine name. All 3 leases had been signed through a property management intermediary that had not disclosed the underlying trust ownership to the tenant. It was not unusual, it was not illegal. It was simply the way Ida May's holdings had always been administered, at arm's length, through proper channels, without any need to announce whose name was on the deed. The leases carried no automatic renewal clause. They expired in 45 days. Upon expiration, without renewal, the trust's reversion rights activated. The buildings on those parcels, the physical structures Fontaine Property Group had financed, developed and named, would revert to trust ownership unless a full buyout was negotiated at current appraised value. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the one question he had been saving. He asked what the Garden District parcel showed. Okafor did not answer immediately. He reached into the file and produced a single document, typed on legal stationery, and slid it across the desk with 2 fingers. Marcus picked it up and read it. It was a title correction notice already filed with the Orleans Parish Recorder of Deeds. A parcel on Audubon Place in the Garden District, incorrectly titled in 1987 due to a clerical error during a subdivision transfer, had been identified as part of the original Ellison Trust acquisition. The correction had been processed. The title now reflected its proper owner. The Fontaine family home sat on Ida May's land. It had always sat on Ida May's land. Marcus set the document down. He looked at the photograph of Ida May on the desk between them. Her yellow dress, her expression that had no patience for nonsense, the unnamed church behind her shoulder. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Bertrand Okafor and said, to proceed, not out of anger, not out of grief, but because Ida May Ellison had spent 25 years buying land that no one believed she should be allowed to own, and she had never once sold an inch of it, and she had left it to him whole and unbroken and clean, and he was not going to let it be disrespected. The slow burn was over. What came next would move differently, precise, surgical, and fast. A plan built on 60 years of patience does not need to move fast, but it does need to move precisely. Bertrand Okafor understood this better than most. He had spent 11 years managing the Ida May Ellison Family Trust with the same disciplined care Ida May herself had used to build it. No noise, no announcements, no unnecessary motion. When Marcus sat across from him the morning after the fire and said the single word proceed, Okafor did not reach for a phone or open a laptop. He reached for a yellow legal pad and wrote 3 lines. Then he explained what was going to happen and in what order, and why the order mattered as much as the actions themselves. The sequence had 3 stages. First, the non-renewal notices, formal letters from Okafor and Whitfield to Fontaine Property Group advising that the ground leases on all 3 trust parcels would not be renewed upon their expiration 45 days from the date of notice. No explanation required, no emotional language. The law did not require Ida May's trust to justify its decision any more than a landlord was required to justify not renewing a lease. The letters would be clean, correct, and devastating in their plainness. Second, the reversion appraisal. An independent property assessor would be commissioned immediately to establish fair market value for all 3 sites. The buyout figure, with the price Fontaine Property Group would need to pay to retain ownership of the buildings they had constructed on Ellison land, would be delivered separately, timed to arrive after the first shock had already set in. Third, the title correction notification. The Garden District letter would go last. It would arrive by hand, not by mail, when the rest of the structure was already shaking. Each document would land alone. Each one would require its own moment of reckoning before the next arrived. That was the architecture of the plan. Not a single blow, but a sequence, spaced to give each consequence room to be fully felt before the next one fell. Marcus's role was silence. Okafor said this clearly, and Marcus agreed without hesitation. No statements to the press, no posts on any platform, no acknowledgement of the viral video, which by that point had been shared 2.3 million times and spawned a comment section that had taken on a life of its own. The internet would do what it did, but Marcus would do nothing. He would not confirm, deny, explain, or engage. He would go to work, come home, and let the documents speak in a language the Fontaines had spent their entire lives claiming to understand better than anyone. The paperwork moved quickly. Okafor's office drafted the non-renewal notices that same afternoon. 3 letters, identical in structure, each addressed to Fontaine Property Group's registered business address on Canal Street. The language was formal and precise, each sentence doing exactly one job. Marcus read them at the conference table and signed the authorization form with the same unhurried steadiness he used to sign survey reports. The reversion appraisal was commissioned on day 2. The assessor Okafor used was a firm out of Baton Rouge, with no prior relationship to any party in New Orleans, clean, credentialed, and thorough. Their preliminary estimate for the 3 properties combined came in at $340 million. Okafor received it on day 8. He filed it and said nothing to anyone. On day 4, Marcus drove to Miss Gloria's house. She answered the door in her housecoat, the gospel station playing low from somewhere inside, the smell of something baking moving through the screen. Marcus held out the photograph of Ida May. The frame had been wiped clean and the glass replaced at a shop on Magazine Street the morning after the fire. Miss Gloria took it with both hands, looked at it, and looked at Marcus. He told her only that Grandma's land was being looked after. Miss Gloria studied his face for a moment. Then she nodded once, out the way a woman nods when she already knew the answer before she asked the question, folded both hands around the photograph, and said she would keep it until he had a proper place to put it. He thanked her. She told him to eat something. He said he would. On day 6, Marcus's personal attorney filed the asset disclosure in the divorce proceeding. It was a standard legal requirement, a full accounting of marital and individual assets submitted to the court. The document listed Marcus Ellison as sole trustee and beneficiary of the Ida May Ellison Family Trust, current assessed value $81.7 billion, generating $12.3 million in annual income. Priscilla's attorney called Okafor's office the following morning. The woman on the other end of the line identified herself and asked to confirm the figures in the disclosure. Okafor's paralegal confirmed them without elaboration. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. Then Priscilla's attorney said she would be in touch and ended the call. On day 10, the non-renewal notices were sealed, stamped, and sent. They were scheduled to arrive at Fontaine Property Group's Canal Street office on day 11. Marcus knew this. He got up on the morning of day 11 the same way he got up every morning. He made coffee, he packed his bag, he loaded his equipment into the bed of the F-150 and drove east toward the job site, windows cracked, the city moving past him in the early light. He went to work. He did not check his phone. Or he did not wonder what was happening 40 miles away. He already knew. He had measured the distance exactly. 40 miles away, Aldous Fontaine was opening an envelope. Day 11 arrived like any other morning. Marcus was on a job site in St. Bernard Parish before 8, boots in soft earth, equipment calibrated, the sun already pressing down with intention. His phone was in his truck. He did not check it. In the Canal Street offices of Fontaine Property Group, Aldous Fontaine opened an envelope. He read the letter once, then he read it again, slower, as if the second reading might produce different words. It did not. The letterhead said Okafor and Whitfield. The language was formal and plain. The ground leases on 3 properties, addresses listed, parcel numbers cited, would not be renewed upon their expiration. The Ida May Ellison Family Trust, as the underlying landowner, intended to exercise its contractual rights as defined in the original lease agreements. Aldous called it a clerical error. He said this out loud to his office manager, then to his operations director, then to the paralegal he kept on retainer for routine matters. Each of them read the letter and said nothing useful. Aldous picked up the phone and called Okafor and Whitfield directly. Bertrand Okafor took the call himself. He confirmed, with the unhurried precision of a man who had anticipated this conversation, that the letter was not a clerical error. He confirmed that the leases carried no automatic renewal provision. He confirmed that the trust's position was final. He thanked Aldous for calling and said his office would be in touch with further documentation. Then he ended the call. Aldous sat very still for a long time after that. Day 14. The reversion appraisal arrived. $340 million. That was the assessed buyout value for all three properties. The price Fontaine Property Group would need to pay in full to retain ownership of the buildings they had built, financed, and named on land that had never belonged to them. Aldous took the document into his private office and closed the door. He called his primary lender that afternoon. The conversation was short and bad. The lender's attorney called back within the hour. The appraisal, combined with the non-renewal notice, triggered a material adverse change clause in Fontaine Property Group's primary credit facility. A covenant default was now on the table. One of the firm's access to its operating line of credit was frozen pending review. $340 million, and the money was not there. Day 17. Priscilla's attorney delivered the asset disclosure. Priscilla was alone in her apartment when she opened it. The one she had moved into 2 weeks earlier with her mother's enthusiastic approval, a clean, expensive unit in a building on St. Charles Avenue that felt like a fresh start. She sat at her kitchen table and read the document. She read the figure at the top of the trust valuation page. Then she set the paper down and looked out the window at the street below for a long time. Nobody saw her face in that moment. Nobody was there to see it. Day 20. Jeffrey stopped returning her calls. He sent one text, brief, carefully worded, or the kind of message a man composes when he wants to exit without leaving fingerprints. He said things had become complicated and that he needed to focus on his own situation. Priscilla read it twice and did not respond. She had known, somewhere underneath the version of events she had been telling herself, that Jeffrey's interest had always been navigational. Now the navigation had changed. She did not call her mother that night. She was not ready for that conversation. Day 23 hit like a freight car. A journalist at a local news station had been working the story on the Fontaine Property Group lease situation since day 15, when a tip came in from a source close to the lender. On day 23, she aired it. The segment opened with the Facebook video, Priscilla on the lawn, the fire, the badge held up to the camera. And then it cut to drone footage of the Fontaine Centre, wide and gleaming in the afternoon sun. Then a chyron appeared at the bottom of the screen. It read, "The land under this building belongs to the man she threw out." The segment ran 3 nights in a row. By the second night it had been clipped and shared 400,000 times. By the third night, the comment sections on every platform had found each other and merged into a single roar. Marcus heard about the segment from a co-worker. He nodded, finished his lunch, and went back to work. Day 28. Deshawn called Marcus's cell phone. Marcus watched the name appear on the screen. He let it ring. He did not call back. Day 33 was the one Okafor had planned most carefully. Aldous arrived at the emergency lender meeting expecting a neutral conference room somewhere in the central business district. Instead, the address Okafor's office had quietly suggested to the lender's coordinator was 1840 Pointe Claire Boulevard, Suite 400, the Fontaine Centre. Aldous walked through the lobby of his own flagship building, rode the elevator to the 4th floor, and sat down in a conference room to negotiate the survival of his company, on land that belonged to Ida Mae Ellison, in a building that in less than 2 weeks would revert to the Ellison Trust if no buyout was completed. He did not say anything when he realized where he was. There was nothing to say. Day 38. A courier arrived at the Fontaine family home on Audubon Place with a hand-delivered envelope from Okafor and Whitfield. Renee signed for it herself. She opened it in the front hallway, standing on the marble floor she had chosen in 2003, in the house she had lived in for 22 years, and considered the physical proof of everything the Fontaine name meant. She read it once, and then she sat down on the bottom stair and did not move for a very long time. Day 40. Renee called Priscilla. The call lasted 4 minutes. On day 41, Aldous Fontaine sent a formal written request to Okafor and Whitfield asking for a direct meeting with Marcus Ellison. His tone, for the first time in the history of their acquaintance, contained no condescension, only urgency, and something that came very close to fear. Marcus read the request that evening. He set it on the kitchen counter. He thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved. Then he called Okafor and told him to confirm the meeting. And he named the location himself. Day 43, the Fontaine Centre, 9 in the morning. Marcus arrived first. He always arrived first. He parked the F-150 in the lot adjacent to the building, as surveying equipment in the bed the same as any other workday, and walked through the lobby doors in his dark pants and collared shirt, with Ida May's photograph tucked under his arm. He crossed the marble floor, polished, expensive, the kind of floor that announces itself, and took a seat at the round table in the ground floor meeting room that Okafor had arranged. He placed the photograph of Ida May on the table in front of him, face up, and he waited. He did not check his phone. He did not rehearse anything. He had been carrying what he needed to say for 8 years. It did not require practice. Aldous arrived 11 minutes later with Priscilla on one side and Deshawn on the other. Renee was not there. The Garden District letter had arrived 5 days ago, and Renee Fontaine had not left the house since. Aldous walked in wearing a suit, which was instinct, the armor of a man who had spent 40 years believing that presentation was protection. He looked older than he had at the fire. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping. He sat down across from Marcus. Priscilla sat to his left. Deshawn sat at the far end and looked at the table. Aldous opened with a proposal. He spoke carefully, in the measured cadence of a man who had prepared remarks and intended to deliver them. He offered a partial buyout, $80 million for the most critical parcel, with a 5-year lease extension on the other 2. He suggested the language of family, of resolution, of mutual benefit. He used the word misunderstanding twice. He said he believed both parties could find a path forward that honored the relationship and served their respective interests. He said he was prepared to be reasonable. He finished. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at Marcus and waited. Marcus looked back at him, and then Marcus began to speak. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward. He spoke in the same measured, unhurried way he did everything. Each sentence placed with the precision of a man who knows exactly where the boundary line is and does not need to wave his arms to indicate it. He said he wanted to go back. Not to the fire, though they would get there. Back further. Back to the first Thanksgiving when Renee Fontaine put his name card at the children's table because she had decided, before she ever had a real conversation with him, that he was not worth a seat among adults. Back to the Christmas newsletter where his wife's name was printed without his beside it, and as if the marriage were a detail too minor to mention. Back to every barbecue where Deshawn reached for a nickname, like a man reaching for a weapon he knew no one would take from him, because no one ever did. He said he remembered the lecture Aldous delivered at the dinner table 6 months ago, the one about legacy and land and what it meant to build something that lasted. He said he had sat at that table and listened to every word of it. He said Aldous had delivered that lecture in front of his own daughter without pausing once to wonder whether the man sitting across from him might know something about land that Aldous did not. He let that sit for a moment. Then he talked about the fire. He said Priscilla stood in their front yard in front of 22,000 people and held up his work badge like it was evidence of a crime. He said she mocked the truck he drove and the calluses on his hands and the way he didn't perform at dinner parties. He said Deshawn carried the boxes. He said Renee watched from the porch and called it the right thing. He said his grandmother's photograph went into that fire. He said it slowly. And then he said the words he had been carrying since the night Miss Gloria pulled that frame from the drum with her bare hands and wiped the ash from the glass without being asked. He said, "You dropped my grandmother's photograph into a fire on camera for 3 million people to see, but what you didn't know was that every building your family put their name on, including the one we're sitting in right now, has been on my grandmother's land since before your parents were married." The room was very quiet. Aldous' hands, I still folded on the table, did not move. But something behind his eyes shifted, like a structure absorbing a load it was not built to carry. Priscilla spoke first. She asked why he had never told her. Marcus turned and looked at her for a long moment. Then he asked her quietly when she had ever asked. She had no answer for that. The question landed the way a survey stake lands, driven clean, marking something that cannot be unmarked. Deshawn said nothing. He had not said a single word since sitting down, and he did not say one now. The man who had carried boxes to a fire, who had named Marcus the groundskeeper at every table where people laughed, sat at the far end of the room and looked at the floor. Aldous asked what Marcus wanted. Marcus told him the trust's position had already been filed with the court and the parish recorder. There was nothing left to negotiate. The documents were what they were. The land was what it had always been. Okafor and Whitfield would handle any remaining correspondence. He stood up. He picked up the photograph of Ida May from the table. Both hands, the same way Miss Gloria had handed it to him 43 days ago in the orange light of his own front yard. He looked at her face one more time. Then he walked across the lobby floor, past the building directory with the Fontaine name at the top, past the marble and the polish and the 20 years of pride that had been built on ground it had never owned. The lobby doors opened. He walked through them. Behind him, Priscilla Fontaine was still seated at the table when the doors closed, and she did not get up for a long time. All what happens to a family that built its identity on land it never owned. The answer arrived in pieces over the 60 days that followed the confrontation, and each piece was more complete and more final than the one before it. Fontaine Property Group entered controlled liquidation within 3 weeks of the meeting at the Fontaine Centre. The covenant default on the primary credit facility, triggered by the reversion appraisal and the non-renewal notices, left Aldous without the financial footing to negotiate, refinance, or fight. The Fontaine Centre and the 2 additional properties reverted to the Ellison Trust upon lease expiration, exactly as the documents had specified. The firm that Aldous had spent 20 years building into a monument to the Fontaine name was formally dissolved 61 days after Marcus walked out of its lobby. There was a brief notice in the business section of the Times-Picayune. It ran without a photograph. The Garden District House took a little longer. The title correction had been filed and recorded, which meant the law was already settled. The family was given 90 days to vacate. Renee Fontaine, who had chosen every fixture and surface in that house with the deliberate care of a woman constructing a legacy, moved into her sister's home in Métairie with what she could pack in a week. She did not make a statement. She did not give an interview. She simply disappeared from the social calendar that had defined her life in New Orleans for 15 years, the way a name disappears from a guest list when the host decides not to include it. Deshawn's corporate sales position lasted 3 weeks past the confrontation before his employer completed a routine background search in preparation for a promotion review. The 3-night news segment surfaced immediately. The clip of him carrying boxes to a fire, his face visible, his participation unmistakable, had been viewed and shared enough times that it required no explanation. He was not terminated for the video. He was passed over for the promotion, reassigned, and resigned 2 weeks later. He moved to Baton Rouge in September and did not announce it. Priscilla received her divorce settlement in October. The court had Marcus's asset disclosure on file, and the settlement reflected it accurately. She was not left without resources, but the Ida Mae Ellison Family Trust was not marital property and had never been. She received nothing from it. She moved out of the St. Charles Avenue apartment and into a smaller place closer to work. She went back to her job at the bank. She stopped posting on the Facebook account where the video still lived, accumulating views and comments like sediment at the bottom of a river. The video stayed up. It always would. Marcus did not ask for it to be taken down. He did not need to. 3 months after the fire, the Ida Mae Ellison Foundation was formally incorporated in the state of Louisiana. Its first program funded land ownership education and title-clearing legal services for families across Louisiana and Mississippi, people who had inherited land and did not know it, or whose titles had been clouded by decades of bureaucratic error and deliberate obstruction, or who simply needed someone in their corner who understood what clean paperwork meant and what it was worth. Bertrand Okafor sat on the foundation's board. The first round of clients served was 47 families. The number was not an accident. On a Saturday in late September, Second Baptist Church dedicated its new community hall. The building was modest and bright, with tall windows that let in the afternoon light and folding chairs arranged in careful rows. The congregation filled it to capacity. The pastor spoke about what it meant to honor those who had built without receiving credit, who had held on without being thanked, who had trusted that what they were protecting would eventually matter to someone they had not yet met. Then he read the name on the dedication plaque, the Ida Mae Ellison Community Hall. Miss Gloria Washington was in the front row. She was wearing her Good Sunday hat, and her hands were folded in her lap, and her eyes were bright with the particular expression of a woman who has lived long enough to see the long arc complete itself. When Marcus caught her eye from across the room, she gave him the same nod she had given him on the day he returned the photograph, a nod that contained everything and required nothing further. After the service, in the churchyard, Marcus was introduced to a woman named Claudette Pierre. She was an archivist at Tulane who had spent the past several months quietly cataloguing Ida Mae's original land acquisition records, deeds, survey notes, correspondence, handwritten registers that documented every purchase from 1959 to 1984. She spoke about the records with a reverence that told Marcus she understood what they represented. Not just real estate, not just assets, evidence of a woman who had believed in something she would not live to see completed. They talked for a long time in the afternoon shade. There was no urgency to the conversation, no performance. Just two people standing next to each other with nowhere else they needed to be. Marcus drove home on a 2-lane road through rural Louisiana, windows down, the late September air carrying the first suggestion of autumn. He drove past cane fields and old oaks and stretches of flat earth that had been here longer than any name anyone had put on anything. He slowed when he saw it. A small iron marker at the edge of a field, set in the ground with the permanence of something that was never meant to be moved. It read, Ellison, I.M., 1961. Ida May had stood on this ground 63 years ago and decided it was worth keeping. Not because of what it was worth in dollars, not because of what anyone else thought it meant, but because she knew, the way certain women know things, deep and wordless and unshakable, that it would matter to someone she had not yet met. She was right. She was always right. And here is what this story asks you to carry with you. Real power does not announce itself. It does not need to perform or boast or hold up a badge at a camera to prove it exists. Real power is patient. It is quiet. It is written into documents that survive long after the people who tried to diminish it have forgotten they ever tried. Ida May Ellison understood that. Marcus Ellison inherited it, and no fire in a front yard in Gentilly could burn away a single acre of what that woman built. Now here is the question for you. If you were Marcus, sitting in that truck watching that fire, knowing what you knew, would you have done the same thing? Would you have stayed silent that long? Would you have waited? Let me know in the comments, because I genuinely want to know your answer. And if this story moved you the way it moved me, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second and it helps more people find stories like this one. If you are not subscribed yet, today is the day. There are more stories coming, and not a single one of them will waste your time. I will see you in the next one.